Hey everyone, welcome to your Learn Lab. I'm Seema, and if you're an IGNOU student, you're in the right place. Here we create videos on different IGNOU courses to help you ace your exams. So hit subscribe and join me on this learning journey. Today we are stepping into modern British poetry, but don't worry, this isn't just a lecture. It's a story about how poetry in Britain shed its old skin, responded to a rapidly changing world, and discovered bold new ways to speak. Imagine a world turning upside down, empires crumbling, two world wars tearing through certainty, machines replacing nature, and people questioning everything. In the midst of this chaos, poets became witnesses, rebels, and visionaries. By the end of this session, you'll not only know the names and movements, but you'll also understand why they wrote, how they broke the rules, and what their words still mean for us today. Let's begin this poetic journey. So, what does this video help us uncover? It's not just about names and dates, it's about understanding why poetry changed and how poets became the voice of their times. Each poet we'll meet, Hardy with his bleak rural landscapes, Yeats with his mystical symbolism, Eliot with his fragmented modernism, Platt with his searing confessions, and Heaney with his earthy Irish lyricism, offers a response to a world in flux. You'll learn how form and feeling changed side by side, how poetry moved from ordered rhyme to disjointed verse, from lofty ideals to raw personal truth. You'll also discover how history, war, trauma, and identity shaped not only what was written but how it was written. In short, this video will help you see poetry not as an escape but as an engagement with the world, with the self, and with the possibilities of language. Let's begin at the roots, before the modernist explosion, with the poets who planted the seeds. In the twilight of the Victorian era, Robert Downing was already pushing boundaries. His dramatic monologues gave voice to deeply flawed, often unsettling characters. His syntax twisted and turned, demanding close attention, an early sign of modern complexity. Then came Thomas Hardy, whose poems grieve the loss of old certainties. His tone is ironic, even cosmic in its pessimism. Hardy writes of country folk and fading beliefs in a voice that's both local and philosophical. And then, like a sudden gust of wild, fresh air, Gerard Manley Hopkins. He broke with conventional rhythm entirely, inventing what he called sprung rhythm to capture the inner pulse of thought and feeling. He spoke of in escape and in stress ways of seeing the unique energy in each thing. Together, these poets began to question Victorian ideals. They fragmented the poetic voice to play with rhythm and diction and opened the door to what we now call modernism. They didn't belong to the modernist movement, but they helped make it possible. Next, we enter the age of Yeats, Eliot, and Pound, poets who didn't just reflect the world, but reimagined what poetry could be. Now, by the final decades of the 19th century, British poetry had begun to evolve in response to new artistic philosophies and continental movements. The influence of aestheticism marked a decisive shift away from Victorian moralism. Poets aligned with this movement, such as Oscar Wilde, saw the poem not as a tool for teaching but as an object of intrinsic beauty, crafted with care, often emotionally restrained, and focused more on form than content. Running parallel to this was the growing impact of French symbolism. This tradition valued ambiguity and musicality, seeking to evoke rather than explain. Symbolist poets believed that truth could be approached only obliquely through suggestive imagery and symbolic resonance. This approach found its way into English poetry through figures like Yeats and later Eliot. At the same time, Impressionism, primarily a visual art movement, began to influence literature. Here, the focus shifted to the subjective, the fleeting, and the fragmentary. What something feels like in a given moment rather than what it objectively is. These aesthetic currents did not yet form a unified poetic movement, but they profoundly shaped the intellectual and stylistic environment in which modernism would take root. Now, the early 20th century brought with it the poetry of the Georgians, a group whose work was shaped largely by nostalgia for a pre-industrial England. Their verses celebrated nature, personal reflection, and traditional verse forms. In poets like Rupert Brooke, we see a lingering romantic idealism untouched by the realities that would soon unfold. But the advent of the First World War shattered these illusions. The war poets, soldiers who experienced the trenches firsthand, gave voice to a new, uncompromising realism. Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Isaac Rosenberg rejected patriotic abstraction in favor of unflinching depictions of suffering, futility, and moral despair. Owen's use of para-rhyme and his bitter irony gave English poetry a language equal to the trauma of modern warfare. This period marked a major shift. Poetry was no longer merely reflective or pastoral, it had become historical testimony. The collision of romantic Georgian legacy with the devastating modern experience of war cleared the ground for modernism to take shape both formally and ideologically. Next, let us discuss Imagism and Ezra Pound. The first organized movement to signal a formal break with the past was Imagism, initiated by Ezra Pound in the early 1910s. Drawing on influences from Japanese haiku, Greek lyric poetry, and even the visual clarity of sculpture, Imagism advocated a radical clarity and consciousness. Pound's manifesto demanded three things: directness, brevity, and rhythm, shaped by the music of language rather than the constraints of traditional meter. Image's poems are stripped of ornament. They rely on the precision of the image to carry meaning rather than rhetorical flourish. Other key contributors such as H.D. and Amy Lowell helped refine this minimalist aesthetic. While the movement itself was short-lived, its impact was enduring. It taught the modern poets that intensity could reside in the simplest image and that restraint could carry great emotional weight. Imagism would also lay the foundation for T.S. Eliot's innovations and for the further fragmentation of voice and structure that modernist poetry would soon embrace. Let's now move on to T.S. Eliot and the Wasteland. T.S. Eliot's Wasteland was published in 1922, and it is often seen as a defining poem of high modernism. It speaks from the heart of a deeply fractured world, a post-war Europe struggling with cultural, spiritual, and personal disintegration. But unlike the direct emotion of romantic or even war poetry, Eliot's response is layered, elusive, and elusive. Eliot draws from a vast network of references: classical mythology, Eastern scriptures, medieval literature, even anthropology. These fragments aren't just decoration. They mimic the very condition of modern life, disordered, recursive, and spiritually hollow. One of the most influential contributions was the concept of poetic impersonality. Eliot believed that the poet should not be emotional center of the poem. Instead, the poem should act like a crucible in which various cultural elements react and converge. This approach was both revolutionary and controversial. Formally, The Wasteland is a dramatic collage. Multiple voices enter and exit, scenes shift without warning, and the traditional structure gives way to a jagged modern syntax. In this, Eliot doesn't just describe modern disorientation, he enacts it. Moving forward, with the rise of fascism and the approach of World War II, a new generation of poets began to emerge, one that could not afford the luxury of pure aestheticism or abstract symbolism. W.H. Auden, the most prominent among them, brought a sharp moral intelligence to poetry. His work wrestles with social injustice, psychological conflict, and spiritual anxiety, but always with a tone that is ironic, reflective, and layered. Unlike Eliot's complex mythic structure, Auden's language often returned to clarity and conversational rhythm. Yet it never lost its intellectual rigor. His poetry speaks to the individual situated within history, a self both shaped by and resistant to its time. Alongside him, poets like Stephen Spender, Louis MacNeice, and Cecil Day Lewis also explored themes of war, identity, and human responsibility. Together, they mark a transition from modernist fragmentation to a more politically engaged and psychologically nuanced poetry. As we enter the 1940s, British poetry experiences a marked shift from the politically engaged realism of the 1930s to a more introspective visionary mode. Central to this transition is Dylan Thomas, whose work epitomizes the New Apocalypse movement. Unlike the straightforward, often socially conscious poetry of the previous decade, Thomas's poems are marked by dense, rich imagery and a lyrical style that borders on the ecstatic. His poetry explores existential themes, birth and death, the cyclic nature of life, and profound religious mysteries, frequently drawing on biblical allusions and symbolic natural imagery. For example, Do Not Go Gentle into the Good Night is a villanelle that confronts mortality with urgent defiance, weaving together personal grief and universal struggle. Fern Hill nostalgically reflects on the innocence of childhood against the inevitability of aging and death, using lush, surreal imagery to evoke a dreamlike state. The New Apocalypse poets rejected the rationalism and political didacticism dominant in the 1930s, turning instead toward the unconscious mind, myth, and dream as sources of poetic inspiration. This movement sought to revive a sense of mystery and spiritual depth through symbolic and sometimes obscure language. While the New Apocalypse movement celebrated imagination and myth, the cultural climate of post-war Britain soon favored a return to sobriety and realism. The next decade, the 1950s, witnessed a reaction against the perceived obscurity and emotional intensity of the 1940s, resulting in what became known as the movement. Let's explore this shift in more detail. Let's now talk about the 1950s. The 1950s represented a significant recalibration in British poetry. After the tumultuous 1940s, the movement poets sought to restore order, clarity, and a sense of everyday reality to their work. This was partly a response to the historical context. The aftermath of World War II brought a desire for stability, normalcy, and a distancing from the emotional excess and abstraction seen in the previous decade. Key figures such as Philip Larkin, Kingsley Amis, and Tom Gunn emphasized the ordinariness of daily life, reflecting on routine activities, provincial towns, and interpersonal relationships with a skeptical eye. Unlike the grand vision and mythic overtones of the New Apocalypse, their poetry is often ironic and restrained, avoiding overt emotion or dramatic gesture. Larkin in particular is known for his careful, formal control and colloquial diction. His poems often reveal the tensions and disappointments lurking beneath seemingly mundane experiences. A bus ride or a church visit, it becomes a moment loaded with existential reflection. Stylistically, the movement poets favored clear, regular stanza forms, wit, and an accessible tone that rejected both the romanticism of earlier periods and the avant-garde experimentation of modernism. They articulated a cautious, often disillusioned view of post-war Britain, foregrounding skepticism and the limitations of human connection. Yet, poetry continued to evolve in complexity. The restrained realism of the movement did not silence the growing interest in exploring the inner self. The 1960s saw the rise of confessionalism and a broader engagement with psychological, political, and regional identity. This development expanded poetic voices and themes significantly. Let's now move on to 1960s and after, confessionalism and beyond. The poetry of the 1960s and subsequent decades reflect a turning inward, a focus on the personal, a psychological, and political dimensions of experience. This era is often defined by the confessional poetry movement, in which poets foreground their own emotions, traumas, and identities as central subject matter. Sylvia Plath is a seminal figure in this movement. Her poetry gives raw and intense expression to mental anguish, depression, and the complexities of gender roles, making the private pain public with unflinching honesty. Plath's work, such as in Ariel, breaks traditional boundaries and incorporates a feminist sensibility that critiques societal expectations. At the same time, Ted Hughes' poetry represents a different yet complementary approach. Hughes revisits myth and elemental violence, focusing on nature's power and brutality. His work explores the primal and often dark forces underpinning human existence. Seamus Heaney brings a deeply regional and historical perspective, using the rural Irish landscape as a site for political reflection and identity formation. His poetry engages with the themes of land, history, and community, especially within the context of the Northern Irish Troubles, demonstrating how regional voices became crucial in expanding the thematic scope of British poetry. Together, these poets illustrate how modern British poetry embraced diversity in form, voice, and theme, moving beyond detached observation to include self exploration, cultural identity, and political consciousness. To conclude, it's important to see modern British poetry as a complex, evolving dialogue. The progression from Hardy through to Heaney charts a continual negotiation between tradition and innovation, public and private, form and meaning. So, modern British poetry spanning from the late 19th century to the late 20th century cannot be understood as a simple linear progression. Rather, it unfolds as a series of responses to shifting historical, social, and cultural pressures. Thomas Hardy begins this trajectory with a subtle critique of Victorian certainties, blending a mournful reflection on tradition with innovations in poetic form. Over time, poets increasingly experimented with style and content, responding to the trauma of two world wars, the rise and fall of empire, and the shifting terrain of identity and politics. We see a movement from addressing collective public concerns toward intensely private and fragmented poetic voices. Themes of fragmentation, symbolism, irony, and confession recur, reflecting poetry's ongoing search for meaning amid modern complexity. For exam success, it's essential to situate poets within their historical movements and to understand how their chosen forms, whether villanelle, free verse, or elegy, reinforce their thematic concerns. By appreciating these interconnections, you gain insight into the rich and varied landscape of modern British poetry, which continues to speak powerfully across time. Well, thank you for engaging with this overview of modern British poetry. Your attention to thematic depth, historical context, and formal innovation will serve you well in your studies. Please share your thoughts and questions in the comment box. And if you found this session helpful, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to Your Learned Lab. I look forward to seeing you in the next session. Until then, happy learning.